Deep under the ruined tower, Walter heard his dead father's voice crackle through an old cassette tape for the first time in 40 years. The flashlight shook in Walter Hay's hand, while dust drifted through the underground vault beneath the collapsed water tower. Ranger stood frozen beside the stairs, ears forward, staring into the dark. Then the cassette player clicked alive. Static, a long breath, and a voice Walter hadn't heard since childhood said, "If my son ever comes back here." Walter stopped breathing. "Because the dead weren't supposed to know where to find you. Would you have kept listening?" Walter Hayes got fired at 2:17 in the morning. The supervisor wouldn't look him in the eye when he said it, just kept rubbing his thumb along the edge of a clipboard while the paper mill thundered behind them. "Corporate's cutting night maintenance," he said. "I'm sorry, Walt." Walter stood there in his grease-stained jacket, hearing the machines roll through another cycle. Steam hissed overhead. Somewhere deep in the building, metal slammed against metal, hard enough to shake the concrete floor. For a second, his shoulders tightened. "Not here," he told himself. "Not now." He unclenched his jaw slowly and nodded once. The supervisor handed him a final envelope. Walter didn't open it. Didn't need to. Men his age already knew what severance looked like before they touched it. "You can clear your locker before sunrise." Walter walked the long hallway alone. Fluorescent lights buzzed above him. His boots echoed across concrete stained by 40 years of oil and pulp dust. He opened his locker, folded 2 work shirts into a duffel bag, then stared at the photograph taped inside the metal door. A younger version of himself stood beside a little boy, holding a fish nearly as long as his arm, Noah, age 10. Walter shut the locker before he could think too long about it. Outside, the October air cut sharp through the valley. His RV sat crooked near the employee fence. 26 feet of faded white fiberglass with rust around the wheel, wells, and a passenger mirror held together by duct tape. Ranger lifted his head the second Walter opened the door. The old German shepherd climbed stiffly from the bench seat and pressed against Walter's leg. "Yeah," Walter muttered softly. "It's one of those nights." Ranger's tail thumped once. Walter poured kibble into a dented metal bowl while he counted cash at the tiny dinette table. 3 20s, a 10, some singles. Not enough to survive winter if the transmission gave out. He folded the money carefully anyway. Old habits. Everything had its place. Flashlight in the left drawer, pocket knife near the sink, tire iron under the bed, boots lined straight beneath the bench. He checked the RV locks twice before pulling onto the highway. The mountains swallowed the road almost immediately. Black ridges, bare trees, fog hanging low in the hollows. Ranger lay behind the passenger seat, ears twitching every time headlights swept across the windshield. Walter drove until dawn stained the clouds gray-blue over Appalachia. He stopped twice, once for gas, once because a state trooper slowed behind the RV too long, and Walter suddenly couldn't breathe right until the cruiser passed. By noon, he rolled into a town called Black Hollow. Population barely visible on the faded sign. A church, a feed store, a diner with a crooked neon coffee cup glowing in the window, and across from the courthouse parking lot, a county surplus auction. Walter only stopped because there were people gathered outside, and nobody questioned an old RV parked near a crowd. A man with a microphone stood on a flatbed trailer, calling bids into cold mountain air. 200 for the backhoe. Do I hear 250? Walter stayed near the edge of the lot. Ranger sat beside him calmly, while townspeople glanced over with the usual look. Old veteran. Old dog. Broke. Move on. He'd seen that look plenty. The auction dragged through rusted equipment and abandoned storage sheds. Walter barely listened until the auctioneer held up a photograph of a collapsed water tower surrounded by weeds. "Next item," he called. "County Parcel 17. Former Black Hollow water site. Half-acre. Condemned tower structure. Sold as is." A few people laughed immediately. The picture showed twisted steel lying across cracked concrete like giant snapped bones. "Starting bid," the auctioneer said, grinning already. $5. Nobody answered. Wind rattled loose signs around the courthouse square. "Come on now," the man laughed. "Land alone's worth more than that." Still nothing. Walter looked down at Ranger. The dog watched him quietly. Walter glanced toward the far edge of town where the broken tower stood above the trees. Private land. No landlord. No deputy knocking on the RV door at midnight. $5 for silence. "That's enough," he muttered. He raised one hand. 5. The crowd turned almost together. Someone chuckled behind him. The auctioneer blinked. "Got $5. Any advance?" "Nothing." "Sold," the man shouted, slamming the gavel down. "To the gentleman with the dog." A few people laughed harder at that. Walter ignored them. 20 minutes later, he signed paperwork inside the courthouse annex, while a bored county clerk slid forms across the counter. "Road's rough getting out there," she said. "Nobody's used that property in years." Walter nodded once. "That's fine." By late afternoon, the RV crawled up a gravel road beyond town. The tower appeared slowly through the trees, or what was left of it. The steel tank had collapsed sideways years ago. Huge support beams lay scattered across dead grass and brush. The concrete foundation remained mostly intact beneath the wreckage. The place looked forgotten. Walter liked it immediately. He parked near the tree line and shut off the engine. Silence settled hard around them. No traffic, no factory noise. Only wind moving through mountain pines. Ranger jumped down first and began circling the property with slow, deliberate steps. Walter did the same automatically. Check perimeter, habit. He noted the broken fence on the west side, a rusted gate hanging crooked, tire tracks near the old access road, but not recent. He checked sightlines without thinking about it. Tree cover, open approach, elevation. Then he caught himself doing it and let out a tired breath. "You're home, old man," he muttered to himself. "Act like it." As darkness settled over Black Hollow, the temperature dropped fast. Walter heated canned stew on the RV stove while Ranger slept near the heater vent. The inside of the camper smelled faintly like diesel fuel, wet fur, and old coffee. Not much, but his after dinner. Walter sat outside in a folding chair staring at the broken tower under moonlight. The steel looked almost silver against the dark hills. For the first time in weeks, nobody needed anything from him. No supervisor, no landlord, no bank, just cold air and quiet. Then the sound came. Clang. Metal striking metal. Somewhere out near the collapsed tower, Walter shot upright instantly. Every muscle locked tight. Another clang echoed through the valley. And suddenly he wasn't in West Virginia anymore. Dust, heat. The distant thump of mortar fire rolling across desert hills. His pulse surged hard enough to hurt. Ranger was beside him immediately. The dog pressed against Walter's knee, solid and warm and real. Walter forced himself to breathe. "One thing you can touch," he whispered hoarsely. The old grounding trick. One thing you can hear. Wind through trees. One thing that's real. Ranger leaned harder against him. Walter rested a shaking hand against the dog's neck until the mountains slowly returned around him. After a while, the panic loosened its grip. The tower stood silent again beneath the moon. Walter looked at it for a long time. Then he whispered, almost embarrassed by the words coming out of his own mouth. Guess we stay here a while. Ranger lifted his head. Far out near the cracked concrete foundation, something caught the dog's attention. His ears rose sharply, and he kept staring into the darkness long after Walter stopped looking. The next morning, Ranger was still watching the tower. Fog drifted low across Black Hollow, while cold sunlight pushed through the trees in pale streaks. Walter stepped out of the RV, carrying a dented coffee mug, and found the dog standing near the cracked concrete foundation, with his tail stiff and ears forward. "You see a raccoon or something?" Walter asked. Ranger didn't move. Walter took a slow sip of coffee. The wind carried the smell of wet steel and dead leaves. Somewhere down the mountain, a train horn echoed through the valley. Still, the dog stayed fixed on the same spot. Walter finally walked over. The foundation spread nearly 30 feet across beneath the collapsed tower remains. Rusted bolts stuck out of the concrete like broken teeth. Grass pushed through cracks along the edges. Years of rain had stained the slab dark gray. Ranger pawed once at the ground near the center. Then again. Walter frowned. "Leave it alone." The dog ignored him. By noon, Walter had settled into work, simply because work kept his head quiet. He dragged twisted pieces of steel into piles beside the fence line, cut loose wire sections with an old pair of bolt cutters, cleared branches that had grown through the wreckage. His movements stayed methodical, same way they always had. One task, then the next. Ranger kept circling back to the concrete. Every 15 minutes, the dog returned there and sniffed the exact same area. By mid-afternoon, Walter got irritated enough to throw his gloves onto the RV hood. "What is your problem today?" Ranger glanced at him briefly, then scratched at the slab again. Walter walked over with a tired sigh. The concrete sounded different there, not by much, just enough that his boots caught it. A duller echo beneath the surface. He crouched slowly, knees popping from years of bad landings and factory floors. The center section looked older than the rest. Cleaner lines, less cracking. Walter rubbed dirt away with his glove. Something straight, not a crack. A seam. Before he could look closer, tires crunched on gravel behind him. Walter stood instantly, too fast. The movement shot pain through his lower back, but his body had already shifted into alert before his mind caught up. A dusty blue pickup rolled onto the property. Walter's jaw tightened automatically. A woman stepped out carrying a paper grocery bag. Mid-60s maybe. Gray hair tied beneath a knit cap, heavy coat, work boots. She stopped a few feet away when she noticed how stiff Walter had gone. "Easy there," she said gently. "I brought food, not trouble." Walter didn't answer right away. Ranger walked between them first, watching carefully. The woman looked down at the dog. "Well, you're handsome." Ranger sniffed her hand once. Didn't bark. That seemed to satisfy her. "I'm Ellie Boone," she said. "Own the hardware store in town." Walter nodded once. "Walter Hayes. I know." That bothered him more than it should have. Small towns worked fast. Ellie held up the bag. Turkey sandwiches. Thermos of coffee. Figured you might need something besides canned stew. Walter stared at the bag but didn't reach for it. "You don't have to do that." "I know." Wind rattled loose steel somewhere behind them. Walter flinched before he could stop himself. It was small, barely visible. But Ellie noticed. Her expression softened without turning pitying. Somehow that made it worse. "You military?" she asked quietly. Walter looked away toward the trees. "Long time ago." "My husband was a firefighter," she said. "Different kind of noise. Same look afterward." Walter stayed silent. Ellie didn't push. She simply set the grocery bag on the RV step. "Well," she said, brushing dirt off her gloves. "Hardware store opens at 7 if you need tools. And if you don't have cash, Don't embarrass yourself pretending otherwise. Walter almost smiled at that. Almost. After she drove away, he stood there a while, watching dust settle across the gravel road. Then Ranger barked sharply. Once. Walter turned back toward the slab. The dog had started digging at the same spot again. Jesus Christ, Walter muttered. He walked over and crouched beside the concrete. This time he pressed his knuckles against it. Solid, solid, then hollow. His eyes narrowed. The seam ran in a rough square shape beneath years of grime and moss. Walter looked around the collapsed tower carefully now. Not casually, professionally. Old municipal structures sometimes had maintenance access below grade. Pump controls, shut-off valves, utility storage. The realization sent a strange little current through him. Not fear exactly, awareness. He grabbed a pry bar from the RV storage compartment and returned to the slab. The metal edge scraped dirt loose slowly. Rust flakes drifted across the concrete. Ranger sat beside him watching every movement. After 20 minutes, Walter uncovered what looked like part of an old steel hatch buried beneath debris. Hell, he whispered. The hatch had been welded shut years ago. Tree roots curled through the edges. One hinge had nearly rusted apart. Walter ran a hand along the surface. Industrial grade. County issue maybe. Not homemade. Ranger lowered his nose near one corner and whined softly. Walter leaned closer. Cold air drifted upward through a gap no wider than a finger. His pulse slowed automatically. Focus narrowing. The same feeling he used to get before entering damaged buildings overseas. Unknown space, unknown risk. He hated that the instinct still lived inside him. But it did. Walter fetched a flashlight from the RV and returned near dusk. The mountains had already started darkening blue around Black Hollow. Wind pushed through the broken tower beams overhead with long, hollow whistles. He wedged the flashlight into the narrow opening. At first, he saw only darkness. Then metal, a staircase. Old steel steps disappearing underground beneath the tower foundation. Walter stared for several seconds without speaking. Behind him, the valley went quiet, except for wind and distant crows. Ranger pressed close against his leg again. Walter swallowed slowly. Well, he muttered. Guess you found something. Walter didn't open the hatch that night. That bothered him more than he expected. 20 years ago, he would have gone down those stairs immediately. No hesitation, no second guessing. Clear the unknown. Move forward. Now he sat awake inside the RV, listening to wind scrape broken steel outside, while Ranger slept near the heater vent. The flashlight rested on the table beside him. So did the pry bar. Walter stared at both for a long time. Around 3 in the morning, a loose section of tower metal clanged somewhere outside and his body jerked upright before his mind caught up. Heart hammering, breath shallow. Ranger lifted his head instantly. I'm fine, Walter whispered. The dog kept watching him anyway. By sunrise, frost coated the dead grass around the tower. Walter drank half a cup of burnt coffee, grabbed the flashlight, and walked back to the hatch without talking himself out of it. Ranger followed close beside him. The steel cover groaned when Walter forced it wider with the pry bar. Rust cracked loose and fell into darkness below. Cold, damp air drifted upward. Not sewer smell. Concrete, machine oil, old water. Walter aimed the flashlight downward again. The stairs descended maybe 15 feet into a square concrete chamber. Industrial, municipal, built to last. He studied the structure automatically. No visible collapse. Surface rust only. Steel supports intact. Still, he tested the first step carefully before putting weight on it. Stay close, he told Ranger. The dog ignored the command and went first. Walter almost smiled. The stairs creaked under their combined weight. Dust floated through the flashlight beam. Halfway down, Walter noticed faded lettering stenciled onto the wall. Black Hollow Municipal Water Authority. Probably 70s era. At the bottom, the beam of light swept across shelves, pipes, and old equipment coated in gray dust. The room looked abandoned, not destroyed, like somebody simply locked the door and never came back. Walter moved slowly through the chamber. Control valves lined one wall beside pressure gauges, frozen decades ago. Metal filing cabinets sat against the far side. A workbench remained cluttered with old wrenches and cracked coffee mugs. Ranger sniffed everywhere. Walter opened the nearest cabinet. Maintenance logs, pipe diagrams, water flow reports. Nothing exciting. Still, he kept reading. Dates stretched across years. Handwritten notes in fading black ink. Repairs, pressure drops, winter freezes, ordinary work, honest work. Then he saw the name. Eli Hayes. Walter froze. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. Inspection completed. E. Hayes. Pump calibration adjusted. Eli Hayes. Walter read the name 3 times before the meaning settled fully into place. His father. The old anger arrived fast and ugly. Not grief, not surprise. Anger. He remembered a man walking out the front door, carrying a duffel bag while Walter's mother cried in the kitchen. He remembered waiting by windows that never opened again. That was the version of Eli Hayes he'd carried most of his life. The man who left. Walter shut the cabinet harder than necessary. Metal slammed through the chamber. Ranger looked up sharply. "Don't," Walter muttered to himself. "Don't start digging around in old ghosts." But he already was. The deeper shelf held cassette tapes stacked inside plastic cases. Most were labeled with dates and utility notes. Pump Station B Winter Main Flush. Pressure Test. One tape had only a handwritten name, Eli. Walter stared at it a long moment before slipping it into his jacket pocket. Ranger suddenly barked once near the back wall. Walter turned. The dog stood beside a rusted metal locker half hidden behind shelving. "Good eye," Walter muttered. The locker door stuck at first. Walter forced it open with the pry bar. Inside sat several sealed envelopes, a flashlight with dead batteries, and another small lockbox containing rolled utility maps tied with faded electrical tape. At the bottom rested a portable cassette recorder. Walter picked it up carefully. Dust coated the buttons, but the battery compartment looked surprisingly clean. His chest tightened slightly. Not fear this time. Something else, like standing outside a room you weren't ready to enter. Above them, tires crunched suddenly on gravel. Walter stiffened instantly. Ranger growled low. Another vehicle door slammed outside near the tower. Walter killed the flashlight automatically. Silence swallowed the chamber, then footsteps. Slow, heavy, confident. Walter moved toward the stairs without thinking. Body low, shoulders tight. Ranger stayed pressed beside him. By the time Walter emerged above ground, the cold mountain sunlight nearly blinded him. A black pickup truck sat near the RV. Clean, expensive. A man stood beside it wearing a dark quilted vest over a flannel shirt. Late 40s, maybe. Well-fed. Broad shoulders, trimmed beard. Not local labor. Money. The man glanced toward Walter climbing from the hatch and raised an eyebrow. "Well," he said calmly. "That's interesting." Walter said nothing. Ranger stepped forward with his ears flat. The man noticed immediately. "Easy, boy." Ranger did not look easy. The man extended a hand anyway. "Travis Mercer." Walter ignored the hand completely. Mercer let it drop without seeming offended. "I own Mercer Development over in Beckley," he said. "I heard somebody bought the tower property. County sold it." "They did." Mercer studied the collapsed structure, then the open hatch behind Walter. "You planning on staying here long?" Walter crossed his arms slowly. Why? Mercer smiled a little. Because I've been trying to buy this parcel for almost 2 years. Wind pushed through the broken tower beams overhead. Walter kept his expression flat, but something tightened quietly in his stomach. Mercer walked a few steps closer to the slab. County kept dragging their feet. Environmental review. Easement issues. Usual mess. He shrugged. Then suddenly some veteran buys the place for $5. Walter's jaw tightened at the word veteran. People said it different ways. Sometimes respectfully. Sometimes like a diagnosis. Mercer nodded toward the hatch. Didn't realize there was still utility access under there. Neither did I. Mercer looked at Walter carefully then, measuring him. How much do you want for the land? Walter almost laughed. You drove out here already planning to buy it. I drive out here planning ahead, Mercer corrected. There's a difference, Ranger growled again. Low and steady. Mercer glanced at the dog. He doesn't like me much. He's got decent instincts. That earned the smallest smile yet from Mercer. Well, he said, stepping back toward his truck, if you decide this place is more trouble than it's worth, call me. He handed Walter a business card. Walter didn't take it. Mercer finally tucked it beneath a windshield wiper on the RV instead. Then he climbed into the truck and drove away down the gravel road without another word. Dust drifted slowly through the cold air after he disappeared. Walter stood there a while, staring at the road. Then he looked back toward the open hatch beneath the tower, toward the darkness below, toward the tapes in his jacket pocket carrying a dead man's voice he hadn't heard in 40 years. Ranger leaned quietly against his leg. Walter swallowed hard. For the first time since arriving in Black Hollow, leaving suddenly didn't feel simple anymore. The cassette recorder still worked. Barely. Walter cleaned corrosion from the battery contacts, using sandpaper from his toolbox, while Ranger watched from the RV doorway. Outside, rain clouds rolled low through the mountains, turning the valley gray before noon. When the recorder finally clicked alive, the sound startled him more than it should have. Static, then breathing, then a man's voice. Testing. All right, if this damn thing's working. Today's October 17th, 1981. Walter froze. The voice sounded older than he remembered. Rougher, tired, but unmistakable. Eli Hayes. Walter sat down slowly at the RV table. Ranger rested his head against Walter's knee as the tape hissed softly. Pressure valve at Station 3 keeps dropping overnight, Eli said. Told the county boys again they need new pipe sections before winter. Freeze cracks the whole line open. Paper shuffled somewhere near the microphone. Then silence for a few seconds. I know they ain't listening. Walter stared at the recorder. This wasn't some goodbye message, not some hidden confession. It was work, just work. Another tape revealed more of the same. Water flow reports, repair notes, complaints about county budgets and failing infrastructure. But underneath all of it sat something else. A man still showing up, a man still trying. By late afternoon, Walter had gone through 6 tapes. His father's voice followed him everywhere now. Through the RV walls, through the trees, through memories he'd spent years trying to bury beneath factory shifts and whiskey and distance. One tape changed everything. The recording began with heavy wind noise. Then Eli spoke quietly. If anybody ever hears this, there's contamination getting into the Eastern Creek line. Walter's stomach tightened. The mining company keeps denying runoff, but I seen the discharge myself after storms. Eli coughed hard into the microphone. County commissioners don't want panic. Company lawyers sure as hell don't want lawsuits. More coughing. They asked me to sign inspection reports anyway. Walter leaned forward unconsciously. I refused. The tape clicked softly as Eli shifted closer. 2 weeks later, they blamed the overflow failure on maintenance negligence. Mine. Walter shut his eyes. He remembered those years differently. His mother crying over unpaid bills, neighbors whispering, his father leaving town. Nobody had ever explained why. The tape continued. They needed somebody local to blame. Easier than fighting a mining company with money. Silence filled the RV after the recording stopped. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the roof. Walter rubbed both hands over his face, hard enough to hurt. For 40 years he'd carried the same story. Your father ran. Simple stories survive, because they're easier to live with. Ranger lifted his head suddenly. Walter looked up. The dog stood near the RV door with ears raised toward the tower. Then Walter heard it too. An engine. A truck climbed the gravel road slowly through the rain. Walter's shoulders tightened automatically. Travis Mercer stepped out wearing a dark rain jacket and carrying an umbrella he never bothered opening. "You always greet visitors like a prison guard," Mercer called. Walter stayed where he was. "What do you want?" Mercer glanced toward the open utility hatch near the tower. "Wanted to make sure you didn't fall down there and die. County paperwork on this property would become a nightmare." Walter almost smiled despite himself. Almost. Mercer walked closer but stopped when Ranger moved between them. "That dog seriously hates me. He's selective." Rain dripped steadily from the collapsed steel overhead. Mercer shoved both hands into his jacket pockets. "I'll skip the sales pitch today. That'd be refreshing." Mercer looked out toward the mountains for a long moment before speaking again. "My grandfather worked for Pike River Mining." He shrugged slightly. "Everybody around here did at some point." Walter said nothing. Mercer continued carefully. "This town survived because of coal money. That also means people looked away from a lot of things." Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. "You knew my father?" "Not really. I knew the stories." Mercer kicked at loose gravel. "Most people," said Eli Hayes, "got railroaded after the creek contamination." Walter stared at him. The rain seemed louder suddenly. Mercer noticed the recorder sitting inside the RV. "Found old tapes?" Walter didn't answer. Mercer nodded once like that told him enough. "My point is this," he said quietly. "Black Hollow's changing. State wants distribution routes through these mountains, logistics hubs, warehouses. Your little tower property sits right where developers want access roads. There it is. I'm being honest with you." Walter crossed his arms. "No, you're being practical." Mercer gave a small, tired smile. "That too." For a second neither man spoke. Only rain, only wind moving through broken steel. Then Ranger yelped sharply. Walter spun immediately. The dog jerked one paw backward, limping away from the tower debris. "Ranger." Walter dropped beside him instantly. A thin strip of rusted metal stuck out beneath loose brush near the slab. Blood dotted the wet concrete. Walt's pulse surged hard enough to blur his hearing for half a second. "Easy. Focus." He checked the paw carefully. Shallow cut along the pad. Not deep, but enough to bleed. Still his hands shook. Mercer crouched nearby. "You got a first aid kit?" Walter snapped. "I got it." Mercer backed off immediately. Walter carried Ranger inside the RV despite the dog's size. Rainwater soaked Walter's jacket while he cleaned the wound at the sink with bottled water and gauze from an old military med kit. Ranger stayed unusually still. "That's right," Walter murmured. "Stay with me." His voice sounded rougher than he intended. The cut wasn't serious. Walter knew that logically. Didn't matter. Fear hit different when you only had one living thing left waiting for you every morning. After bandaging the paw, Walter sat beside the dinette while Ranger rested near the heater. Mercer remained outside under the rain near the tower, strangely patient. Finally, Walter stepped back out. Mercer glanced toward the RV. "Dog okay? He'll live." "Good." Rain mist drifted sideways through the valley now. Mercer looked older suddenly, less polished. "My offer still stands," he said quietly. "Sell the property. Walk away before the county starts tearing this area apart." Walter stared toward the collapsed tower, toward the hatch below it, toward the dead man's voice waiting on old tapes inside the RV. "I think my father came back here," Walter said without meaning to. Mercer studied him carefully. "Maybe he never really left," Mercer answered. Then he climbed into his truck and disappeared down the mountain road. Walter stood alone in the rain a while longer. When he finally returned inside, Ranger lifted his head weakly from the blanket. Walter sat beside him on the floor. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere deep beyond the hills. Walter reached for another cassette tape, with his father's handwriting across the label. His fingers stopped suddenly. There was an envelope tucked beneath the recorder, yellowed with age, unopened, and across the front, in Eli Hayes' uneven handwriting, were 6 words Walter never expected to read. "For Walter, if I come back." Walter stared at the envelope, while rain tapped steadily against the RV roof. Ranger slept beside the heater with his bandaged paw stretched awkwardly across the blanket. Every now and then the dog twitched in his sleep, chasing something through old dreams. Walter envied that. He turned the envelope over once, then again, still sealed. His father's handwriting looked shaky, older than the notes in the utility logs downstairs. Walter finally opened it just before midnight. Inside sat only one folded page. No apology, no grand explanation, just a letter written in careful, uneven lines. "Walter, if this reaches you, then I didn't make it back out here again. I kept thinking I'd have time to explain things face to face someday. Funny thing about someday." Walter stopped reading for a moment. Outside, wind groaned through the collapsed tower. He kept going. "You were angry when I left. You had every right to be. But I need you to understand something. Men can survive being hated a lot longer than can survive disappointing the people they love." Walter's jaw tightened hard enough to ache. The letter continued. "I thought leaving would protect you from what was coming after the contamination hearings. Maybe that was cowardice. Maybe it wasn't. I still don't know. But I never stopped checking on you." Walter lowered the page slowly. For years he'd imagined this moment differently. He'd imagined fury, closure, something clean. Instead, he just felt tired, deep tired, the kind that settles into a man after carrying the same anger too long. Ranger lifted his head and limped over quietly, pressing against Walter's leg. Walter scratched behind the dog's ears absent-mindedly while staring at the letter. Near the bottom, Eli had added one final line. "You were always better at building things than breaking them." Walter folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. Then he sat awake until dawn. The cold arrived fast after that. Appalachian winters didn't wait politely for people to prepare. Frost hardened the ground each morning now. Wind pushed down from the ridges sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Walter knew the RV wouldn't survive months of mountain weather without help, so he started building. The collapsed tower gave him plenty of steel, bent beams, corrugated panels, salvageable brackets, ugly material but usable. He spent 3 days welding together a rough lean-to beside the RV. Nothing fancy, just enough structure to block wind and snow. Work settled his nerves better than sleep ever did. Measure, cut, weld, repeat. Ranger followed him everywhere, despite the injured paw. The dog limped less each day now, though Walter still checked the bandage every morning like clockwork. By the end of the week, Smoke curled from a small oil heater inside the makeshift garage. Walter stood in the doorway, looking at it with quiet satisfaction. Functional. That mattered more than pretty. The next afternoon, an old green pickup rattled onto the property, carrying more rust than paint. Walter looked up from a welding torch automatically. An elderly man climbed out slowly. Tall once, lean now, heavy flannel coat, thick white beard. He studied the garage frame a long moment. "That your weld line there?" he asked finally. Walter nodded. "Not bad. Thanks." The old man stepped closer. "You Eli Hayes, boy?" Walter stiffened instantly. The man noticed. "Easy," he said. "Name's Amos Pike." The name sounded familiar somehow. Then Walter remembered. Pike River Mining. Mercer had mentioned it. Amos pointed toward the tower. "I worked maintenance crews around here 40 years. Knew your father some." Walter set down the welding mask slowly. "People seem real interested in my father all of a sudden." Amos shrugged. "Dead men get more popular once everybody responsible starts dying too." Walter almost laughed at that. Almost. Amos walked around the garage structure carefully, studying the weld joints. "Your father built things solid too," he said quietly. "Town treated him ugly anyway." Walter folded his arms. "That's not exactly how my mother remembered it." Amos nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer. "Well," he muttered. "Pain rearranges memory sometimes." That irritated Walter immediately. "My mother struggled because he left. And your father struggled because he stayed too long." The words landed harder than Walter expected. Wind rattled loose steel overhead. Ranger watched Amos closely but didn't growl. That seemed important somehow. Amos sat on an overturned bucket near the garage entrance while Walter worked. Didn't hover, didn't pry much. Just talked occasionally. About winters in Black Hollow. About collapsed mines. About how every man in Appalachia eventually either fixed machinery or buried somebody who did. By sunset, Walter realized he hadn't minded the company. That realization bothered him too. Before leaving, Amos opened the truck bed and pulled out an old wood stove pipe section. "Got spare pieces if you need heat," he said. "No charge." Walter immediately shook his head. "I can pay." Amos snorted. "Son, if I needed money, I wouldn't still be driving this death trap." Walter hesitated, then nodded once. "Appreciate it." Amos pointed toward the garage. "You keep building like this, folks around town will start showing up with broken lawnmowers. They can keep driving. Probably won't." He was right. 3 days later, a woman arrived carrying a chainsaw that wouldn't start. Walter fixed it in 20 minutes. She left 2 bags of groceries beside the RV before driving off. The next morning, a teenager brought over a broken generator, then an old farmer with a busted heater fan. Walter never asked for payment. People left things anyway. Eggs, diesel fuel, canned soup. One man traded firewood for a carburetor repair. Somehow the ruined tower lot started feeling less abandoned. Not alive exactly, but occupied. One freezing evening, Walter sat inside the garage, sharpening tools, while snow drifted softly beyond the open doorway. Ranger slept beside the heater. The sound almost made Walter drowsy. Then Amos appeared carrying a folded county map. "Found something," he said. Walter looked up carefully. Amos spread the map across the workbench beneath the hanging lamp. Old utility routes crossed the mountains in faded red lines. One section had been circled decades ago in marker. A pipeline extension running deep into the woods behind the tower. Amos tapped the map once. "Your father spent years working this line after the county shut most of it down." Walter frowned. "Why?" Amos looked toward the dark trees beyond the garage. "Because Eli Hayes was too stubborn to quit taking care of things." Snow swirled quietly outside. Walter stared at the marked route disappearing into the mountains. Ranger suddenly lifted his head, ears forward again. Watching the woods, Walter looked beyond the edge of the garage light toward the dark tree line behind the tower. Snow drifted through the pines in slow, thin ribbons. "What is it?" Amos asked quietly. Walter didn't answer right away. Ranger stood now, alert, focused, not scared, listening. That old military instinct crawled up Walter's spine before he could stop it. Scan the perimeter, identify movement, check exits. Nothing moved out there. Still, Ranger kept staring. Finally, the dog relaxed and settled back beside the heater with a grunt. Walter exhaled slowly. Amos noticed. "You sleep much these days?" he asked. Walter snorted softly. "Not since about 2009. Amos nodded, like he understood more than he said. Before leaving that night, he tapped the old utility map again. "If you follow that line east," Amos said, "you'll find what's left of Pump Station 3. "The one from the tapes?" "Same one." Amos pulled his coat tighter against the cold. "Most folks forgot it exists." Walter studied the faded red line, disappearing deep into the woods. Forgotten places had a way of finding him lately. The next morning came hard and white with frost. Walter packed carefully before heading into the woods. Flashlight, tow rope, bolt cutters, first aid kit. Habit stacked each item in exact order near the RV door before he loaded them. Ranger watched the whole process like he always did. "You ready?" Walter asked. The dog's tail thumped once. They left just after sunrise. The old utility path barely existed anymore. Snow covered most of it, but Walter could still spot pieces of rusted pipe markers and broken service posts buried beneath vines. The farther they walked, the quieter the mountains became. No highway noise, no town, only boots crunching frozen leaves, and Ranger moving ahead through the trees. Walter found himself slipping into old patterns without thinking, watching ridgelines, checking footing, reading terrain. Afghanistan had burned that into him permanently. After nearly an hour, Ranger stopped beside a collapsed chain-link fence hidden under brush. Walter brushed snow away from a faded warning sign. "County Water Access, authorized personnel." Only beyond the fence sat a low concrete structure half swallowed by the hillside. Pump Station 3, or what remained of it. The roof sagged badly on one side. Rust streaked the walls. One metal door hung crooked from broken hinges. Walter moved carefully toward the entrance. The place felt unstable immediately. Ranger whined low. "I know," Walter murmured. Inside smelled like wet concrete and old oil. Flashlight beams cut through darkness, revealing broken gauges, dead electrical panels, and corroded pipes running along the walls. But somebody had been here, not recently, years ago. Walter saw it in the repairs. Sections of pipe had been patched by hand. Valve seals replaced using mismatched parts. New bolts beside 40-year-old metal. He recognized the style instantly. Field repairs, cheap, functional, temporary. Exactly the kind of work a man did when nobody gave him proper funding anymore. Walter crouched near one patched junction. Initials scratched into the metal. EH. He stared at them a long time. Ranger wandered deeper into the station, nails clicking softly across concrete. Then suddenly barked once. Walter followed. The back room had partially collapsed inward. Dirt and broken beams spilled through the ceiling, where years of rain had weakened the structure. A folding cot still sat against one wall beneath dusty blankets. Nearby rested an old kerosene heater and stacks of canned food long expired. Walter's chest tightened slowly. His father had stayed here. Not once, repeatedly. The evidence sat everywhere now. Maintenance logs stacked in milk crates, replacement parts, flashlights, work gloves hanging from nails. A life built quietly in the dark where nobody noticed. Walter picked up one notebook carefully. Most pages contained pressure readings and repair schedules. Then one entry stopped him cold. January 12. Line froze again near Eastern Ridge. Town won't make it through another hard winter if main pipe bursts. Walter swallowed hard. His father had kept repairing a system for a town that blamed him for its problems. Without pay, without recognition, without anyone even knowing. Ranger suddenly growled, low, sharp. Walter turned immediately. A deep crack echoed through the station. The floor shifted slightly beneath his boots. "Move!" Walter snapped. Ranger obeyed instantly. Walter backed toward the doorway carefully, flashlight sweeping overhead. A support beam near the rear wall bent downward with a groan. Too much snow weight on the weakened roof. Walter moved faster. Another crack. Concrete dust rained down beside him. Then Ranger barked furiously from outside. Walter stepped toward the exit, and part of the floor collapsed where he'd been standing seconds earlier. Wood and concrete crashed into darkness below. Walter hit the frozen ground outside, breathing hard. Pure instinct. Years of emergency drills, firing through muscle memory before thought could catch up. Ranger pressed against him immediately. Walter rested one shaking hand against the dog's neck. "I'm good," he muttered automatically. His heartbeat disagreed. For a minute he simply stood there listening to the mountains, to wind through dead branches, to his own breathing slowing again. Then another sound reached them. Engines. Walter frowned. Ranger's ears rose instantly toward the ridge. Two white trucks crawled slowly along a logging road, uphill from the station's survey vehicles. Walter recognized the orange markers attached to the sides. He crouched behind brush automatically. The trucks stopped near the ridge, clearing above the old pipeline route. Men climbed out carrying equipment cases and measuring poles. One jacket carried the Mercer Development logo. Walter watched silently. So Mercer wasn't waiting anymore. The survey had started. One of the workers hammered a bright red stake into the frozen ground above the valley. Another unfolded maps against the truck hood. Walter looked back toward the collapsing pump station, toward the patched pipes his father had spent years maintaining in secret, toward the hidden work nobody ever thanked him for. Something shifted quietly inside Walter then. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding, maybe. The dangerous kind. Ranger nudged Walter's hand suddenly. Walter looked down. The dog stood facing the station entrance again, waiting. Walter frowned. What now? Ranger slipped back inside before Walter could stop him. Damn it, Ranger. Walter followed carefully through the unstable doorway. The dog moved straight toward the rear office wall near the collapsed floor, then stopped beside an old metal locker tipped partly sideways beneath debris. Walter pulled it free carefully. Inside sat only a thermos, a flashlight, and one final cassette tape sealed inside a freezer bag. Black marker across the label read, "If my son ever comes back here." Walter held the cassette in his hand the entire walk back through the woods. Snow melted slowly off pine branches overhead. The mountains had gone quiet again after the survey trucks disappeared. Ranger stayed close beside him, closer than usual. Like the dog understood something. Heavy was sitting inside Walter's chest now. By the time they reached the tower lot, dusk had already settled into the valley. Walter lit the garage heater, fed Ranger half a can of beef stew, then sat alone at the workbench, staring at the cassette player. He almost didn't press play. Part of him wanted to leave the tape untouched forever. Unopened things still carried hope. Once you listened, you had to live with whatever came next. Finally, the recorder clicked. Static filled the garage, then his father's breathing. Older now, weaker. If my son ever comes back here, Eli said softly, then I guess I finally ran out of time. Walter lowered his eyes. The heater ticked quietly beside them. I don't know what you heard growing up, Eli continued. Probably enough to hate me. Walter swallowed hard. I deserved some of that. The tape crackled. I should've come back sooner. Pride's a dangerous thing in a man, especially one who thinks surviving means staying silent. Walter stared at the concrete floor. Outside, wind rattled loose metal against the collapsed tower. I kept telling myself I'd fix things first. Get stable first. Make enough money first. Eli coughed badly. Years pass real quick when you keep waiting to become somebody worth coming home as. Walter closed his eyes, because he understood that sentence too well. The tape continued. Your mother never cashed most of the checks I mailed. Sent half of back unopened. A long pause followed. Can't blame her much. Ranger lifted his head from the blanket near the heater. I heard you joined the army. Eli's voice softened slightly there. Didn't surprise me. You always stood watch over everybody, even when you were little. Walter rubbed one hand across his mouth slowly. You probably think I abandoned you, Eli said. Truth is, I thought staying away would stop my mess from becoming yours. The words hit harder than Walter expected, not because they fixed anything, because they sounded painfully believable. The recording hissed again. Then came the sentence Walter wasn't ready for. I checked on you twice after you came home from overseas. Walter froze completely. The garage suddenly felt too small. One time outside Charleston. One time at the paper mill parking lot. Eli's breathing turned uneven. You looked tired both times, like somebody still listening for incoming. Walter's heartbeat started climbing. Fast. Sharp. The tape kept going. I wanted to walk over and talk to you. But you carried the same look I used to see in the mirror after the contamination hearings. Eli coughed again. A man holding himself together 1 hour at a time. Walter stood abruptly and shut the recorder off. Silence slammed into the garage. Too quiet, too tight. His pulse hammered behind his eyes now. The heater ticking, wind outside, metal clanging somewhere near the tower. Then suddenly, rotor blades, low, heavy. A helicopter crossed somewhere beyond the valley. Walter's entire body locked instantly. His breathing shortened. The garage disappeared. Afghanistan rushed back hard and ugly. Dust, heat, radio chatter, incoming mortar alarms somewhere beyond the wire. Walter grabbed the edge of the workbench as the panic climbed his throat. Not now. Not here. Ranger moved immediately. The dog limped across the floor and pressed his full weight against Walter's legs, grounding him, keeping him in place. Walter bent forward sharply, both hands gripping the dog's fur, while the helicopter sound faded slowly into the mountains. Easy, he whispered hoarsely. Ranger stayed there, steady, warm, alive. Walter focused on that instead. Dog breathing, concrete floor, cold air, garage light humming overhead. Not Afghanistan, not anymore. Eventually, his heartbeat slowed enough for him to sit back down. Ranger climbed beside the chair awkwardly and rested his head across Walter's knee. Walter scratched behind the dog's ears with shaking fingers. You're getting old, buddy. Ranger's tail thumped once. Walter looked toward the cassette recorder again, then toward the dark valley beyond the garage. His father had spent years trying to reach him without knowing how, and Walter suddenly realized he'd done the exact same thing to his own son, Noah, 32 years old now, living somewhere outside Columbus, last Walter heard. They barely spoke twice a year, birthdays mostly, short calls, careful conversations that avoided anything real. Walter always blamed the distance on divorce, on deployments, on work schedules. But sitting there beside the dying heater, he recognized the truth for what it was. He only knew how to survive, not stay. That realization hurt worse than anger ever had. Walter stared at the old flip phone charging near the toolbox. He hadn't called Noah in nearly 5 months. Outside, snow started falling harder. Inside, Ranger remained pressed against him like an anchor. Finally, Walter grabbed the phone before he could change his mind. The number still sat saved under Noah. His thumb hovered over the call button a long time, then pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Walter nearly hung up. Then a voice answered, "Dad?" Walter forgot every sentence he planned during those first 2 seconds. Noah sounded older, tired, cautious. "Hey," Walter managed finally. Silence followed. Not hostile, just unfamiliar. "You all right?" Noah asked. Walter almost lied automatically. Instead, he looked around the garage, at the heater, the half-built walls, the tower, the dog beside him, and the tapes of a father he'd misunderstood for most of his life. "No," Walter admitted quietly. "Not exactly." Another silence. Then Noah exhaled softly through the phone. "What happened?" Walter stared out toward the snow-covered tower. "I found something out here," he said. "About your grandfather." Noah didn't answer immediately. But he didn't hang up either. Walter told him about the tower, the utility vault, the tapes. Not everything. Just enough. When he finally stopped talking, the line stayed quiet a long moment. Then Noah said something Walter never expected. "I think you should called sooner." Walter shut his eyes briefly. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Wind pushed snow against the garage doors. Far away, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the mountains. Noah spoke again. "Where exactly are you?" Walter frowned slightly. "Black Hollow." Another pause. Then car engine noise crackled faintly through the phone. Walter straightened slowly. "Noah." His son cleared his throat. "I'm already driving east," he said quietly. "I'll be there tomorrow." Walter didn't sleep much after that. He tried. Lay down inside the RV, closed his eyes, counted heater clicks, listened to wind moving through the tower frame. Didn't matter. His brain stayed wide awake. By 4 in the morning, he gave up completely and went outside with a flashlight and welding gloves. Snow covered the tower lot in pale silver. The mountains looked frozen, solid under the moonlight. Ranger limped beside him through the drifts. Walter started organizing his tools in the garage for no real reason. Wrenches by size. Extension cords rolled tight. Fuel cans lined up against the wall. The kind of pointless, busy work men do when they're nervous and refuse to admit it. Ranger eventually settled near the heater and watched him silently. "You could at least pretend this isn't weird," Walter muttered. The dog blinked slowly. Around noon, headlights finally climbed the gravel road. Walter straightened immediately. A dark blue pickup rolled onto the property and stopped beside the tower. For a second, nobody moved. Then the driver's door opened. Noah Hayes stepped out looking older than Walter remembered. Broader shoulders now. Beard coming in gray around the chin. Heavy winter jacket zipped halfway up. He looked tired too. Not physically. Life-tired. Walter recognized that kind instantly. Noah glanced around the property first. The collapsed tower, the garage, the RV. Then his eyes landed on Walter. "Jesus," he muttered quietly. "You actually bought a water tower." Walter snorted once despite himself. $5. Noah stared at him another second before shaking his head slowly. "That somehow makes more sense." Neither man moved closer. Years sat between them like another person standing there. Ranger solved it first. The dog walked carefully through the snow toward Noah and sniffed his boots. Noah crouched automatically to pet him. "Hey, old man," he said softly. Ranger's tail thumped once. Walter noticed the knot in his chest loosen just a little. You drove all night, Walter asked. Pretty much. You eat? Gas station coffee counts? No. Noah smiled faintly at that. It disappeared fast. Walter led him into the garage, where heat from the oil stove fogged the cold air near the doorway. Noah looked around slowly. You built all this? Most of it. With scrap tower steel? Walter shrugged. Materials, material. Noah nodded once. Then his eyes landed on the cassette tapes stacked carefully along the workbench. That's him? Walter knew who he meant immediately. Yeah. Noah picked up one tape carefully. Never met the guy. Walter leaned against the workbench quietly. Neither did I. Not really. The words hung there a while. Noah finally set the tape back down. I almost didn't come, he admitted. Walter nodded slowly. I know. You disappear for months sometimes. Noah shoved both hands into his jacket pockets. Then, suddenly, I get a phone call about secret tunnels and dead grandfathers. Utility vault, Walter corrected automatically. Noah laughed once through his nose. There he is. Walter frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? That. Noah gestured vaguely toward him, always correcting details, always acting like facts matter more than people. The words landed harder than Noah probably intended. Walter looked away first. Outside, wind rattled the tower beams overhead. Noah sighed quietly. Sorry. No, Walter said after a second. You're not wrong. That surprised both of them. Ranger shifted closer between their boots and settled onto the floor. Noah scratched behind the dog's ears absently. He still follows you everywhere? Pretty much. Mom used to say, you trusted that dog more than most humans. Walter stared at the heater flames. She wasn't wrong either. Silence again. Not hostile this time. Just awkward. Different. Noah eventually walked toward the open garage door and looked out at the tower. So what now? Walter stepped beside him. Mercer Development wants the property. The guy with the survey crews? Walter looked over sharply. You saw them? Past 2 trucks on the access road coming up. Noah frowned toward the ridge. Looks like they're already marking routes. Walter's jaw tightened. Right on cue, another engine echoed faintly through the valley. A black SUV climbed the gravel road toward the tower. Travis Mercer stepped out, wearing a heavy coat and leather gloves. His eyes shifted immediately between Walter and Noah. Well, Mercer said calmly. Family reunion. Noah crossed his arms. You the developer? That obvious? Kind of. Mercer nodded politely before looking back at Walter. I came to make one final offer before permits move forward. Walter already looked exhausted by the conversation. I'm not selling. You haven't heard the number yet. Noah, Walter said quietly without looking away from Mercer. Inside the garage. No. Walter's voice hardened instantly. Inside. For a second, Noah looked 12 years old again. Defiant, angry. Then he shook his head. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Walter blinked once. Noah stepped closer instead of backing away. You shut people out whenever things get uncomfortable. His voice stayed calm but tight. You did it my whole life. Mercer looked like a man regretting every life decision that brought him to this mountain. Walter folded his arms. Not now. Then when? The cold air between them sharpened immediately. Ranger stood up slowly, watching both men. Noah exhaled hard through his nose. You think you're different from your father because you stayed physically closer, he said quietly. But, emotionally? Half the time you weren't even in the room. Walter flinched almost invisibly. Mercer looked away politely toward the tower. Noah rubbed one hand across his beard. I'm not trying to hurt you, he muttered. I spent years wondering whether anything mattered more to you than surviving another day. Walter stared at the snow, at the rusted tower steel, at his own boots. When he finally spoke, His voice sounded older somehow. "I don't really know how to do anything else." That honesty changed the air immediately. Noah looked at him differently after that. Not fixed, not healed, but seen. Ranger pressed against Walter's leg quietly. Mercer cleared his throat awkwardly. "For what it's worth, my offer still stands. But maybe hold on to the property until spring before deciding," Walter frowned. "That's new." Mercer shrugged slightly. "Maybe I'm learning some things too." Then thunder rolled suddenly across the mountains. All three men looked toward the dark ridge line. Storm clouds moved fast over Appalachia in winter, and these looked mean. Mercer glanced uphill toward the survey route. "My crews are still marking soil conditions near the eastern line." Another crack of thunder shook the valley. Walter's military instincts kicked immediately. "Pull them out." Mercer looked back sharply. "What?" "The ground up there's unstable, near the old pipeline." Walter grabbed his coat, already moving toward the garage entrance. "If heavy rain hits frozen soil tonight, that ridge is coming down." Mercer hesitated only half a second before pulling out his phone. That alone told Walter something important. The man listened when danger sounded real. Rain began falling before Mercer finished dialing. Cold, hard, fast. And somewhere deep in the mountains beyond the tower, Ranger suddenly barked toward the ridge line, like he heard something coming long before the humans did. The rain hit all at once. Hard sheets slamming across the tower, locked sideways in the wind. Walter grabbed his coat from the garage hook, while Mercer shouted into his phone near the SUV. "Get them off the ridge now," Mercer snapped. "I'm serious. Pull everybody back." Thunder cracked above the valley. Noah stepped beside Walter at the garage entrance. "You really think the slope's gonna fail?" Walter watched muddy water already carving paths downhill through the gravel. "Frozen ground under heavy rain," he muttered. "Yeah, I do." Ranger barked again, then took off running toward the eastern trail. Walter's stomach dropped instantly. "Ranger!" The dog disappeared into the rain. Walter swore under his breath and grabbed a flashlight. Noah followed immediately. Mercer looked up from his phone. "My crews are still up there. They lost radio signal." Walter didn't hesitate anymore. "Let's move." The three men pushed into the woods while rain hammered the mountains around them. Mud sucked at their boots. Branches whipped sideways in the wind. Ranger's barking echoed faintly somewhere ahead. Walter moved fast despite his age. Pure muscle memory taking over now. Assess terrain. Watch footing. Keep people moving. Noah noticed it immediately. "You've done this before," he shouted over the storm. Walter didn't answer. He already sounded like someone else in his own head. Calm, sharp, focused. The old utility trail had become a river of brown runoff by the time they reached the Ridge Access Road. One Mercer survey truck sat tilted dangerously near the slope edge. Its rear tires spun uselessly in mud. Three workers stood outside trying to secure equipment cases beneath the pouring rain. "Leave the gear," Mercer yelled. One younger worker pointed downhill frantically. "Danny slipped." Walter followed the flashlight beam toward the ravine below. A man clung halfway down the muddy slope near exposed pipeline sections. Every few seconds more dirt slid beneath him. Ranger stood 20 feet away, barking furiously into the storm. The dog had found him first. Walter immediately scanned the terrain. Slope unstable, loose rock, bad angle for direct descent. Noah stepped beside him, breathing hard. "What's the plan?" Walter already pulled tow rope from his shoulder pack. "You anchor me to that pine," he pointed fast. "Mercer, get everybody back from the edge." Less weight, nobody argued. That surprised Walter almost as much as the storm itself. Within seconds, Noah secured the rope around Walter's waist exactly how Walter instructed. Hands steady. Quick learner. Or maybe he'd simply spent years watching his father more closely than Walter realized. Walter moved downhill carefully through the mud toward the trapped worker. Rain blurred visibility now. The mountain groaned somewhere beneath them. Not thunder. Movement. Walter knew the difference immediately. "Hurry!" Noah shouted. Danny looked barely 22. Terrified. Mud coated half his face. "I can't move," he gasped. "My leg's stuck." Walter reached him and checked quickly. Boot trapped beneath broken pipe bracing. Walter dug hard with both hands while rainwater poured past them downhill. "Look at me," Walter barked. Danny did instantly. "Stop panicking and breathe." The kid nodded shakily. Above them, Ranger barked wildly again. Walter glanced uphill. The dog stood near the ridge edge, staring toward shifting trees farther above. Then Walter heard it, a deep cracking sound rolling through the mountain. "Move!" he shouted. The slope gave way seconds later. Mud, rock, and shattered branches exploded downhill behind them. Walter ripped Danny free and shoved him sideways, just as debris slammed across the spot where they'd been trapped. The rope snapped tight around Walter's waist. Pain shot through his ribs as Noah and Mercer dragged both men uphill through the sliding mud. For one terrible second, Walter lost footing completely. The mountains spun sideways. Rain, darkness, flashback, mortar impact, dust clouds, men screaming over radios. Walter's breathing locked instantly. Not here, not now, but panic didn't care about location. Steel from the old survey equipment crashed nearby, with a sound too close to incoming artillery. Walter froze completely. Noah grabbed him hard by the shoulders. "Dad." Walter couldn't answer. His chest tightened violently. The storm disappeared again beneath old battlefield noise clawing through his head. Then Ranger slammed against him full force. The dog planted both front paws against Walter's chest and barked directly into his face. Sharp. Real. Walter blinked hard. Rain returned. Mountains returned. Noah's hands gripping his jacket returned. "Stay with me," Noah shouted. Walter sucked air back into his lungs painfully. "I'm good," he rasped automatically. Noah almost laughed despite the storm. "No, you're not." That honesty cut through the panic better than comfort would have. Above them, Mercer helped pull Danny onto stable ground beside the trucks. The younger worker sat shaking in the mud while Ranger paced circles around him protectively. Mercer stared at Walter differently now. Not like a stubborn old man sitting on valuable property, like somebody who just saved lives. The rain eased slightly after another 20 minutes, enough for emergency crews from town to finally arrive. Red lights flashed through the trees while paramedics checked Danny's leg. Nothing broken. Lucky. Walter stood off to the side, soaked to the bone, while Noah handed him a thermos from one of the trucks. Coffee, terrible coffee, still hot. Walter drank silently. Mercer approached after speaking with the rescue team. "You were right about the ridge," he said quietly. Walter shrugged tiredly. "Mountain was already warning us." Mercer looked toward the buried pipeline below the slope. "My father used to talk about Eli Hayes sometimes," he admitted after a long pause. "Said he was difficult, angry, stubborn as hell." Mercer glanced toward Walter. "But he also said Eli cared more about this town than the people running it did." Walter stared out at the storm-dark mountains. "That sounds about right." Mercer shoved both hands into his soaked coat pockets. "I don't think I understood that before now." Noah leaned against the truck nearby, listening quietly. Ranger settled at Walter's boots, exhausted but alert. For a while, nobody spoke. Only rain dripping from trees. only distant radio chatter from rescue crews. Then Noah looked toward the tower road disappearing through the valley. "What if we stayed?" he asked suddenly. Walter frowned slightly. "Stayed where?" "Here." Noah gestured toward Black Hollow, toward the tower, toward the mountains. "You already built half a garage," he shrugged. "Could turn it into a real workshop." Walter stared at him. Noah continued carefully now. "For veterans, kids, people who need work done. Whatever." He kicked mud off his boots. "This place already kinda feels like people are finding their way here." Walter looked down at Ranger, sleeping against his leg, then toward the storm clouds, finally breaking over the ridgeline. For the first time in years, the idea of staying somewhere didn't feel like failure. It felt dangerous, but maybe necessary too. Winter passed slowly in Black Hollow, not all at once, a little at a time. Snow melted from the ridgetops first. Then the creek behind the tower broke loose from ice. Mud replaced frost along the utility road, and somehow people kept showing up. At first it was small things. A farmer with a broken generator, a widow needing help repairing a porch rail, a teenage kid wanting to learn how to weld because the mine his father worked at had shut down. Walter never advertised anything. Didn't need to. Word traveled the way it always had through mountain towns, quietly. From diner booths and hardware store aisles and church parking lots. By March, the garage beside the collapsed tower no longer looked temporary. Noah helped frame proper walls using reclaimed lumber from an abandoned barn outside town. Amos donated old shop lights. Ellie Boone from the hardware store somehow kept accidentally delivering boxes of screws and insulation. Nobody remembered ordering. Walter stopped arguing about it after the third week, mostly because Noah laughed every time he tried. "You know people are helping because they want to, right?" Walter grunted while tightening bolts along the workbench frame, still suspicious. "Yeah," Noah muttered. "That's becoming obvious." But the tension between them had changed now. Less sharp, less careful, not fixed completely. Some things don't repair clean. Still, they worked side by side almost every day. And that mattered. Ranger supervised everything from an old blanket near the heater. The dog had slowed down noticeably since winter. More gray around the muzzle now. Stiffer getting up in the mornings. But every single time someone drove onto the property, Ranger still dragged himself to the doorway, first like guarding the place, remained his official assignment. Walter understood that feeling better than anybody. One Saturday morning, Noah arrived, carrying a hand-painted sign in the truck bed. He leaned it against the garage wall proudly. Black Hollow Workshop Repairs, Welding, Small Engine Work. Walter stared at it. "You made a sign. You bought a water tower for $5, Noah replied. "We all got problems." Even Walter laughed at that one. The workshop opened officially 2 weeks later. No ribbon cutting, no speeches, just brewing beside the tool bench while half the county wandered, in and out all day, carrying broken things. A retired mechanic spent 3 hours helping a teenager rebuild a lawnmower engine. Amos taught 2 boys how to weld scrap steel safely without blinding themselves. Ellie arrived with soup in a slow cooker large enough to feed an army. Mercer showed up too. That surprised everybody most. Especially Walter. The black SUV rolled onto the property early that afternoon, carrying stacks of lumber tied down beneath the tarp. Mercer climbed out looking uncomfortable already. "I had extra materials left over from another project," he said. Walter raised an eyebrow. "That's so." Mercer glanced toward Noah. "All right, fine. I bought them." Noah smirked immediately. Mercer sighed. "You people are exhausting." Still, he unloaded every board himself. Before leaving, he paused near the tower foundation beside Walter. My grandfather knew Eli Hayes wasn't responsible for the contamination mess, Mercer admitted quietly. Most people around here figured that out eventually. He looked toward the workshop, but by then nobody wanted to reopen old damage. Walter watched people moving through the garage, talking, building, laughing. Seems like that's all this town did for a long time, he said. Mercer nodded once, then surprised Walter again. He'd probably like this place, Mercer said softly. Your father. Walter looked toward the old tower, at the rusted steel still standing against the mountains. Maybe he would. Spring arrived fully by April. Wildflowers pushed through gravel around the foundation. The mountains turned green again. Warm air drifted through the open workshop doors, carrying the smell of sawdust and engine oil. One afternoon, Walter climbed a ladder beside the workbench wall while Noah steadied the base below. "You sure that thing's level?" Walter asked. "It's level. You didn't even check." "I checked before you asked." Walter grunted suspiciously, but kept hammering anyway. When he climbed back down, the old wooden sign hung firmly above the workshop entrance. Built to keep something alive. The words came from one of Eli's tapes. Walter hadn't planned on using them, but they stayed in his head. Now they stayed on the wall, too. That evening, after everybody left, the property finally grew quiet again. The workshop lights glowed softly against the dark valley. Crickets hummed beyond the creek. Noah sat on the tailgate drinking coffee while Ranger slept stretched across his boots. "You know," Noah said eventually, "you could probably make real money doing this." Walter looked up from cleaning grease off a wrench. Thought that wasn't the point. "It's not." Noah smiled slightly. "Just saying, you finally built something people want to stay around." Walter leaned back in the chair slowly. The words settled deeper than Noah probably realized. For most of his life, Walter had measured survival in short distances. One deployment at a time. One paycheck at a time. One sleepless night at a time. He never planned far enough ahead to imagine staying anywhere permanently. Now there were people expecting him tomorrow morning. People bringing broken things because they trusted him to fix them. That still felt strange. Ranger stirred awake beside the porch steps and slowly carried himself toward the workshop entrance one last time before settling there with a tired sigh. Guard position. Same as always. Walter watched the old dog carefully. "You hanging in there, buddy?" Ranger opened one eye briefly. Tail thump, then sleep again. Noah smiled toward the dog. "He picked this place before any of us did." Walter looked out across the property. At the garage, built from tower steel. At the workshop, lights glowing warm against the mountains. At the foundation his father once maintained long after everyone else gave up on it. Funny thing was, the tower had collapsed years ago. But the foundation stayed. Walter finally understood why that mattered. He sat there long after dark listening to distant tools settling in the workshop as metal cooled for the night. No artillery echoes, no factory noise, no highway calling him somewhere else. Just wind moving softly through Appalachia. For the first time in years, Walter Hayes didn't feel like a man hiding from his life. He felt like somebody who had finally stopped running long enough to belong somewhere. And beside the workshop door, Ranger kept watch over the place they stayed. Maybe that was the real lesson hiding underneath the old tower all along. Not money, not land, not even the secrets Walter spent his whole life angry enough to avoid. Sometimes a person survives for so long. They forget survival isn't the same thing as living. Walter thought he needed to stay alone to protect himself. Ranger never believed that. The old dog kept pulling him back toward people. back toward trust, back toward a place worth waking up for. And maybe that's what loyalty really looks like. Not somebody fixing your pain overnight, just somebody staying long enough so you don't carry it alone anymore. A small town, a stubborn son, a tired veteran, an old German shepherd lying beside a workshop door. None of them perfect, but together they became enough. If this story meant something to you, let me ask you one simple thing. Do you think people heal better alone, or when somebody chooses to stay beside them? Type 0 for alone, or 1 for together. And if you'd like to hear more stories about second chances, forgotten people, loyal dogs, and the quiet ways lives can still change late in the journey, you're welcome to stay here with us for the next one. Good night, and take care of each other.